Welcome to the course on Indian writing in English translation, and today we will be speaking about decolonizing the bookshelf beyond Eurocentric perspective. Indian literature, as we all know, that mostly as a corpus is creation of the Orientalist and the Indologist, but we will try to talk about Indian literature and decolonizing the bookshelf of Indian literature without the Eurocentric perspectives, and we will try to imagine Indian literature with various other perspectives what comes from ancient, medieval and modern Indian historiographer and other literary critics. So what does decolonizing mean? Decolonizing mean not just adding diverse voices to existing canons, but it is something else, and we will explain that. Challenging the epistemological frameworks themselves, questioning who decides what counts as literature. Because so far, when we talk about literature, we mostly define literature with the Western method and Western epistemology. So we have to extend our idea of literature with other models, methods, and aesthetics. Dismantling center-periphery hierarchies and recognizing indigenous aesthetic system. So we will not only talk about the Greek, Roman or other European aesthetics and epistemology, but we will be talking about various other Indian aesthetics like Sanskrit aesthetics, aesthetics found in Tamil language, aesthetics found in Urdu, in Arabic and Persian tradition, and also aesthetic thought which is found in various other Indian languages since last 200 years. Recognizing and this is how, by recognizing indigenous aesthetic system, we will try to decolonize our idea of Indian literature and idea of our bookshelves of Indian literature. So how Eurocentrism shapes our reading? Canon formed based on European aesthetic values. The very idea of literature, what we perceived, it comes from Greco-Roman tradition. And this is how European literature was assumed as the literature. And therefore, with the colonial modernity, Indian authors, they were very much influenced by European model of writing literature. But if we do deep investigation, with the literary composition of colonial India, we can find, though in surface level, Indian authors were very much influenced by Western aesthetics and Western model of writing, but they also inherited literary traditions of ancient and medieval India with their reading of Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit and Perso-Arabic literature, and also their reception from oral tradition. Therefore, in colonial modernity, though in surface level, we found that literature is defined by Western method and models, but there was an undertone of Indian writing system, Indian storytelling system and all. And we have to recognize all these multiple systems which are there under the surface level of Indian writings. Periodization like Renaissance, Romantic, Victorian, Modernist, Indian literary tradition. When we composed Indian literary history, that model also received from the Orientalist and the Indologist like Weber, like Vintanis, like J. Gonda, and we followed the historiographic model given by them. But Indian literature is not only the written tradition, but it is also oral tradition. It exists in memory also. Therefore, we have to have our own tradition of writing history, and those traditions can be found in ancient and medieval literary traditions of India, like Kolhan's Raj Tarangini, Assam's Burunji, or Madlapaji from Odisha. So there are several indigenous model of writing history of Indian literature. Even in Perso-Arabic tradition, we can found Nu Sifir by Amir Khusro, and in that Nu Sifir, Amir Khusro talked about history of Indian languages. He talked about history of Indian literatures. So in India, since the pre-colonial period, we are having different models of writing Indian literary histories, but due to the Macaulay's minutes and the hierarchy of English as a language of the colonizer and the language of the administration, aristocrats and elites, and with the expansion of English education system, we actually deviated from these traditions of indigenous writing system, indigenous philosophical and historiographical system. So when we talk about decolonizing Indian bookshelves, or when we call for going beyond the Eurocentrism, we have to go back to various Indian traditions, what are there in Indian intellectual culture. Therefore, rewriting the history, reshaping the history of Indian literature is very important. It should not be the imitation of the historiographic model proposed by European historian and what is found in the history of English literature. For example, in Indian literary history, we can find Dark Age as a period during 13th century, 12th, 13th century. But that dark age actually comes from the history of British English literature. And in India, there was no dark age as such. This is the politics of communal historiography of Indian literature, because when we talk about dark age and scarcity of literature, it was the time when we have ample number of oral traditions and oral literature, and literature also produced by different other traditions like Buddhist traditions, Jain traditions. Therefore, we blindly cannot follow the historiography, the Western or European historiography, as a model of writing history of Indian literature. We need to revisit our literary history in detail, and we have to reshape the literary history of India. Literary movements defined by European geography and the history, but we have to find the new models of writing history, not only with the movement or the periods as suggested by European literature. There are certain theories like structuralism, post-structuralism, or psychoanalysis, and mostly all these are European theories. But Indian theoreticians or Indian critics, they also proposed different philosophical traditions and connected those philosophical traditions with the literature. In India, the religious tradition and the philosophical tradition resulted with a large number of literary epistemology, like the Jain tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Hindu tradition, and there are many minor religious sects and traditions, what also resulted a large number of Indian literature. Those are organic, those are associated with the community, like the Vaishnavite tradition, Bhakti tradition, the Shakta tradition. All these traditions resulted into literature, and later the Dalit movement or different other tribal movements also gave birth of large number of Indian literature. So with considering these movements or situations in literary history, we have to reshape the bookshelves of Indian literature. There are great tradition in the history. There are certain smaller traditions in history, and those traditions are also associated with the creative expression of the populace, of the community, and those actually comprised diversity in Indian literature, and that gave us non-European paradigm in Indian literature. That is very important. Nambar Singh, in today's lecture, Nambar Singh is one of the most significant literary critic who contributed significantly in the history of Indian literature to decolonize Indian literature. Number Singh was a literary critic who mostly written in Hindi, and he was well versed with a few other Indian languages, and he proposed certain models of decolonizing Indian literature. Therefore, Number Singh in today's India appeared as very significant critic, because he is not like any other post-colonial thinkers who wrote in English and who were initially trained by English education. Number Singh was exception. He was trained in Indian languages, he wrote in Indian languages, and he proposed models of decolonizing Indian literature. So that is very important aspects and in Indian today's or contemporary Indian literary criticism, and this is most important contribution by Number Singh. So Number Singh was particularly focused to contribute to decolonize Indian mind with new imagination of Indian literary system, Indian literary criticism, and Indian literary historiography. So he challenged the critical frameworks of West, which is imposed in Indian literature. He challenged the colonial education, which created the mental colonization even after 1947. Indian intellectuals analyzed Indian literature using only Western theories and frameworks. So Number Singh's objective was to analyze Indian literature with Indian critical framework, because Number Singh argued that India never had crisis or lack in critical systems or in critical tool, because we had complex philosophical traditions since last thousands of years. Indian philosophical system in Sanskrit, Indian philosophical system in Pali, in Prakrit, and many other Indian languages actually offer new critical tools and discursive framework to analyze Indian literature. Therefore, Number Singh appeared as most significant turning point, a turning critic in Indian literary critical system, and that is an alternative to even the post-colonial thinking system or the post-colonial thinkers. This is how he challenged the Western theories and Western frameworks. English Education Act of Macaulay in 1835 created the Brown Englishmen, and Number Singh challenged this idea of Brown Englishmen, and he challenged the colonized mind of the Brown Englishmen. And therefore, he proposed Indian literatures marginalized in own educational system should be reanalyzed and it should be revisited. His argument was that Indian literary system, Indian literature written in different Indian languages is actually marginalized, because most of the Indian literary practices are dominated by either English or other European literatures which are translated into English, but Indian literatures are ignored, they are marginalized. And for example, if you visit the history of Indian universities in India, you can find that there are hardly, only few disciplines of Indian literature or comparative Indian literature. Most of the disciplines of literature in India is English and the regional languages departments. Why I call it a regional language department? Because all these language departments are centered in particular region. Like the Bengali literature departments are mostly located in Bengal, though few Bengali literature departments are there other than the geo-cultural space of West Bengal. So the Tamil is located in a particular region, Malayalam is located in particular region, Assamese is located in particular region. Therefore, we do not have chance to learn the Indian literary tradition with its multiplicity. Therefore, Nambar Singh argued that Indian literature as a corpus is actually marginalized in our Indian academic system. And Indian academic system literature is only dominated by the Western literature or literature of so-called Commonwealth countries or the post-colonial spaces, and literary studies is of interest of Europe and America only. And therefore we create the literary disciplines and areas of investigation, subject of inquiry as per the models and the methods which are received from either British academia or the American academia. Nambar Singh was one who strongly against of it and who proposed again and again about the central position, about Indian literature getting central position in Indian universities. That is his most important significant. And to do so, he proposed various models, methods throughout his life and throughout his various works, essays in writing, written in Hindi. He talked about Sanskrit, Persian, and regional literary tradition as devalued in India. So he talked about valuing these literary traditions because we have very complex philosophical and theoretical traditions in various Indian languages. The twice born intellectuals. Colonial education created Indians English in taste and intellect and alienated from their own languages, aesthetics, and people. And in today's Indian academia also, when we talked about humanities and social science, we can find that most of the scholars of humanities and social sciences in India, they are trained in English medium schools, English medium colleges and universities, and their point of reference is also English text or the text which are translated into English. But translation has its own limitation always, because when one text is translated, that text is selected by a translator who is a reader or who is a practitioner of literature or humanities and social science in general. But that is a deviation from the organized structure of intellectual growth and development found in any Indian language. Therefore, translation alone cannot help to decolonize the Indian mind when it is particularly about the study of humanities and social sciences. And Nambar Singh was strong critic of it, that most of the humanities and social science scholar in India, their study, their point of exchanges and point of references are coming from English language sources, not from Indian language sources. And if it is from Indian language sources, then also it is very much selective. Either it is translated into English or it is selected, very much selected text from Indian languages, but it does not represent the holistic intellectual tradition found in any Indian language. Though there are few genius intellectuals who are exception of that, but mostly Indian academia is dominated by this structure or method and model of studying humanities and social sciences in India. Therefore, decolonization is actually about an epistemological shift. We have to shift our epistemological culture and the subject of inquiry. It is not about just adding the diversity, because adding the diversity is also a method of homogenization, because when a text is translated into English, it is translated as per the requirement of English critical system, as per the requirement of English academia, as per the requirement of English translation method or publishing English books by an international or nationally reputed house. Therefore, the critical discourses and voices also have been changed. Therefore, when we talk about decolonization, it is about epistemological shift. We have to shift our total epistemological inquiry from one writing system, one knowledge system found in English into another writing system and a knowledge system which is found in various Indian languages. That is important. Nambar Singh also proved Indian literature must be read through Indian eyes first, using Indian critical tools, not as exotic additions to European frameworks, but as autonomous traditions with their own sophisticated theoretical foundation. Because Indian literature is not created only with the response of European or English literature, but it has been emerged from its own culture, own linguistic tradition, own religious tradition, and own cultural heritage. Therefore, Indian literature should be assessed, should be evaluated, should be studied in connection with that particular geo-cultural and linguistic space. That is very important. It should not be considered as exotic addition to the diversity to satisfy the plurality objective of Europeans or English education. Therefore, deconstructing Eurocentric periodization of literary history is very important. Indian Renaissance, Bengal 19th century, but Renaissance for what? From what? Or Renaissance for whom? That has to be questioned. Indian Romanticism, does this apply to Mir Taki Mir or Bharatendu Harishchandra? We have to think about it. When we talk about modernism in Premchand and Tagore, or these are same or the different trajectories, we have to think about it. Because when we talk about Indian modernism, when we talk about Indian Romanticism, it extensively comes from Indian Vedic tradition, Indian spiritual tradition, the Chayabad, the Hindi literary movement, which is considered as a romantic literary movement in Hindi and Indian literature, also comes from Indian spiritual tradition, and the Vedic philosophical tradition like peacemaking, like love, the universal humanism and all. When Tagore appeared as one of the most important modern Indian poet or modern Asian poet, Tagore actually emerged with his reception and perception of Upanishadic tradition and the Vedic tradition. So the universal humanism, what is reflected in various literary creation and the philosophical writings by Tagore, is actually a result of universal humanism, which is coming from a Vedic tradition and Upanishadic tradition. That is very important. Therefore, the Western idea of Romanticism, Western idea of modernism, the Western idea of Renaissance is actually not applicable in Indian context, because in India, in different intellectual and cultural tradition, it has its own timely Renaissance or modernism or romanticism or something else, and Indians have their own words and terms to express their movement in literary history. So that should not be replaced by Western theoretical traditions or philosophical tradition just to find out the similarity between Indian literature and Western literature. That is a responsibility of today's literary critic and the literary historian in India. Therefore, Europe cannot be assumed as universal standard, and we have to ignore the parallel developments in Indian literature. That love cannot be considered as equivalent to the romantic movement in European tradition, because love is very old and ancient theme of Indian literature, and the same goes for the idea of sexuality, which is very ancient practice in Indian literature, and that is reflected in Indian literature, art and culture. So that cannot be equated with any other movements of Europe, because India has its own history, age-old history, and later long history of all these thematic traditions in Indian literature. Therefore, the indigenous continuities or indigenous traditions cannot be considered as obscured, because Indian communities actually grows up and they carry all these traditions always during the pre-modern time, during the modern time, during the contemporary time. Therefore, we have to find out the alternative periodization in our literary history, and Number Singh also talked about, focus about this alternative periodization. In Decolonizing the Mind, Gugio Thiongo presents a manifesto for linguistic decolonization, because linguistic decolonization is fundamental thing to decolonize our epistemology. Therefore, linguistic decolonization is very, very important. When Gugio Thiongo talked about decolonizing the linguistic, talked about linguistic decolonization, he talked about Tagore, he talked about Indian traditions. So, we need to go beyond the European paradigms to find the alternative models and to decolonize linguistic and philosophical traditions in India. Gugio Thiongo periodizes African literature based on the politics of languages and the ongoing struggle against imperialism. And India has all different types of movements, struggles, and situations in Indian literary history to decolonize the Indian mind. And Gugio Thiongo calls for renaissance in African cultures by advocating for the return to the native language. And in India also we can find the nativism, the emergence of nativism as an idea to redefine Indian literary traditions. Valchandra Nemade, the famous Marathi author and literary critic, talked about nativism, and later literary critic of today's India, Makrand Paranjape, also talked about nativism, and that includes various indigenous tradition of Indian literature, and this is how they proposed new frameworks to read and to understand Indian literary tradition. If we talk about Indian Dalit literature, for example, Daya Pawar's autobiography Bolut, which is written in Marathi, that autobiography represents not only the stories about Daya Pawar himself or the stories of the community, but that autobiography actually represents the local culture, the regional belief, the philosophical tradition, the political tradition of the communities in Maharashtra. And this is how we can find how alternative political space, philosophical space have been created throughout our literary practices. Therefore, all these alternative traditions should be addressed to understand the critical composition of Indian literature, and those will help us to rethink about Indian literary theory and the Indian literary history. Indian literary history on its own terms. There are several terms and theoretical understanding about history of Indian literature, like Bhakti movement. There is a long history of Bhakti movement from 6th to 17th century, and entire India responded towards the philosophy and the literary tradition, religious tradition of Bhakti movement, and it was a devotional revolution in which all the communities have been participated, irrespective of their class, caste, region, religion, and all. There was a Riti period, there was Navajagaran or awakening period in Indian literature, there was Pragatibad or progressive writers association, their contribution in Indian literature, and these were not limited to particular section of the literary practitioners or the literary elites, but entire community, entire nation responded towards it. That is very important. Therefore, indigenous aesthetic continuities has to be recognized, like the continuities of rasa theory, the continuities of oral tradition like Baul, Pandavani, the Ramayana recitation, the frame narratives like Panchatantra, Katha Sarit Sagar or Bital Panchabimshati, how these stories have been recreated since last hundred of years. The poetic devices like Alankara, Dhvani, Vakrakti, or the Dhvani Rasa by Abhinava Bharati, all these theoretical traditions actually received, practiced, and reflected in today's Indian literature also. So that has to be, recognized, and that is very important. World literature, though it comes from European and American perspective, but we also have our own idea of imagining the Vishwa, the entire world. Therefore, Tagore comes with universal humanism. So we have alternative perspectives of world literature from Indian literary traditions. So that has to be recognized, that how love, how humanism helped us to imagine the world, and therefore helped us to imagine world literature. Therefore, it is not only the David Damrosch masterpiece creation of the ideas, the definitions, new definitions of world literature, but it is also Indian mind what contributed a lot to imagine the entire universe, the world, and the world literature. So all these alternative perspectives should be object or subject of inquiry in our academic discipline to reimagine Indian literature and reimagine Indian bookshelves. Therefore, the decolonizing method, the comparative methodologies, all these are very important, because comparative methodology talks about reshaping the canon and reshaping Indian literary history, reshaping the literary history and the movements. And therefore, we can find that David Damrosch, during the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic situation, went beyond Europe and America-centric literary traditions and went towards Asian, the Oceania, the Southeast Asia, to find new literary imagination, and that is a requirement in our world academia also. Therefore, East Asian literature, beyond the imagination of the Orientalist and the Indologist, is very important. Therefore, we have to go towards the Southeast Asia. We have to find the new literary transaction and the connection between India and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, the Central Asia. Then only we will be able to decolonize Indian mind, and in modern time, in this contemporary time, we will be able to reconceptualize Indian literary history, because Indian literary history is not only about the colonial transaction between India and Europe, but it has its long history of pre-colonial transaction with Central Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Middle East Asia. And Indian mind, their imagination and their nostalgia is also made with the literary content of all these regions. That is very important. Therefore, all these regions like Southeast Asian literature and their diverse tradition, which is so far overlooked, has to be reconnected, because India has a deep emotional and cultural connection with these literary traditions. And we have to recognize the multiplicity of Indian literary tradition. Like there are Sanskrit, Tamil, Hindi, Bengali, Urdu, Malayalam, and many other modern Indian languages what carry multiple religious and philosophical traditions of Indian literatures. And this is how we have to acknowledge the literary pluralism what is found in Indian literature. Then only we will be able to create a network of diverse Indian literature, and that network of diversity in Indian literature will help us to decolonize our bookshelves. Therefore, understanding and recognizing folk literature, tribal literature, and various indigenous Indian literature, Adivasi literature is important to decolonize the mind of, the Indian mind, to recreate new imagination about literature. Therefore, we have to understand that tribal literature, Dalit literature, and indigenous literary systems are very, very important, because those are very much powerful to help us to decolonize our literary mind. And one thing we have to keep in mind, that decolonization does not mean a rejection, but decolonization means reinvention and putting importance to those traditions which are not, which did not get enough focus or importance so far. That is why it is very important. And translation and decolonization in some time appears as paradox, because when we talk about about translation, we mostly talk about translation in English language. Therefore, translation from, the between Indian traditions and between Indian languages other than English is also very important. And therefore, we have to recognize the politics of, translation, and how translation act as a method of decolonization, and how translation becomes paradox of method of decolonization. In conclusion, we will end with this, that what does a decolonized bookshelf look like? It focuses, or it talks about multilingualism in Indian literature, or multilingual in Indian literature in translation. It talked about multi-temporal. It does not talk about only the contemporary Indian literature, but it talks about ancient literature and the contemporary literature. It talked about multiple genre, not only written literature, but the oral literature, performative literature, and all. It talked about polycentric literature. There is no single center of literature. There are multiple centers of literature in India. It talks about self-reflectivity, aware of its own limitation, and decolonization is not a metaphor. It requires concrete changes in what we read, how we read, and whose knowledge we value. That is very important. And Number Singh, throughout his intellectual work, throughout his life, he tried to do so. Thank you.